Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. My name is Donovan Hendris, and it had been almost 6 months since I had last delivered a shipment to a place as picturesque, so I was excited about the job for once. It was March 2008, and I was making my regular rounds as a truck driver, delivering cargo to remote locations across the US. This time, I was assigned to a forested area in eastern Oregon, driving along the winding roads that wind through the dense pine trees, which by nature usually make for a pleasant change of pace, with the sweet scent of vegetation thick in the air. I suddenly noticed an odd sight: a row of barbed wire fences stretched alongside the road, seemingly protecting a large swath of land hidden beneath a cover of trees. This was as curious as it was to me to have their allure. What in the world could be so valuable or dangerous to warrant such a drastic security measure in the middle of nowhere? At that moment, my mind was racing with a thought that made me laugh. I knew better, but for a brief moment, I felt like the lead character in my own adventure film. By late afternoon, the sun had hung low. As I arrived at my drop-off location, an old, abandoned logging camp with deteriorating cabins and machinery strewn all over, I realized that this must be my client's property, which is why there was such an intricate fence system. I couldn't help but wonder what they were going to do with all this land, but I continued working as usual for a short while, oblivious to the difficulties that lay ahead. Everything changed when I unloaded my belongings close to one of the old cabins and noticed a figure observing me from inside. At first glance, the man looked like a regular guy in tattered clothes, but upon closer inspection, I saw that he was actually a very unsettling visage. He exuded a sinister and unsettling energy that caused a malicious glint in his dark eyes to distort his tattered appearance. I did my best to contain the panic that swept through me when he produced a large, gory-looking axe from behind his back and said, "Hey, can I help you?" I stammered, unable to stop the man's slow, deliberate movements as he started to leave the cabin. His features, including more deeply scarred flesh across his cheek and an abnormally twisted smile, increased my anxiety. In an effort to put some distance between myself and this terrifying figure, I cautiously backed towards my truck with one eye still fixed on him. Unfortunately, this also put my plans for loading cargo on hold, which ultimately led me to make the heartbreaking decision to call for help over the radio, as I nervously explained. I had a flood of adrenaline running through my veins, but he had not responded, not even acknowledging me. It was hardly unusual for truckers working in remote areas these days to run into ruffians. I'd seen enough movies about highwaymen, but something felt inexplicably different in the back of my mind. I joked with my dispatcher before my predicament on the airwaves, and the urge to laugh at my own ridiculously childish situation almost overcame me, breaking out in a hollow laugh. "This man looks like he's going to turn me into his next piece." Those waiting on the other end of my plea offered me little consolation, but I froze, waiting for help to arrive. Meanwhile, the man with the sinister presence kept approaching me menacingly, each step as painful and deliberate as the one before. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to hide my fear, but he didn't respond, and his expression didn't change. Desperate, I took out my phone and called 911 as fast as I could. I told the operator where I was and what was going on, and he assured me that the police were coming. Minutes seemed to drag on. I watched the ominous figure approach him. A siren's wail pierced the tense air, and the terrifying man stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting towards the direction of the sound as police cars pulled up at breakneck speeds with officers piling up. His twisted smile never left his face, and his hand gripping the axe started to shake slightly, almost imperceptibly, posing a threat unlike anything I had ever encountered. As more officers rushed into action around him, he appeared unfazed by their presence as he slowly raised his hands and surrendered. They handcuffed him without protest as the police conducted checks and gathered statements. One officer barked at the man, and he reluctantly let go of the axe, letting it fall to the ground with a disheartening clang. I watched this eerie figure from a distance, and even now that he is cornered and captured, he insisted that his eyes had a sinister aura and were narrow slits filled with unquenchable loathing. One of the officers came up to me to take my statement, and he disclosed that they knew this man's background as an ex-convict who had served time for particularly heinous murders that involved the dismemberment of victims with axes and knives, had reportedly just been released from prison a few weeks earlier. I was terrified of what might have happened if assistance hadn't come so swiftly. The officer held out his hand to offer me condolences and pledged to prosecute me to the fullest extent of the law. That night, I was unable to sleep, and 4 weeks afterward, any creaking in the dark would make me shudder because I felt like I was being watched by when I was working on those isolated roads in the past. That twisted face made me constantly check my mirrors. The days that followed the incident and the court proceedings went by quickly, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I might at any time catch a glimpse of another evil lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. Months later, I got a call from the same officer who had told me about the terrible events of that fateful day, and concluded that the man would not be leaving prison anytime soon because his past crimes, combined with his threatening demeanor and recent attempts at acts of terror, had put him firmly behind bars for good. As terrified as I had been during those moments of unspeakable horror, I knew that I no longer needed to worry, because the suffering this man caused to others would eventually end as life remained somewhat lighter than before. But occasionally, flashbacks to him would remind me how fortunate I was to be alive, and how alert one must be no matter where life takes them. Even a straightforward job like mine can be disrupted by unforeseen terrors hiding in the shadows. Since I had been a truck driver for more than 10 years and knew the American highways like the back of my hand, the crisp air of October 2013 welcomed me as I got into my truck and prepared for another workday. My name is Ned Harrison, and this particular route took me through a remote area in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, with endless trees on both sides of the winding roads. Approximately 7:30 a.m. I heard people going missing, so I rolled when my CB radio started crackling and was static before another driver's voice said, "Hey Ned, did you hear about those strange happenings around these parts?" He insisted that I get a run and catch you later, but my eyes said, "Come on, Davey. You know that kind of stuff always pops up once Halloween's around the corner." That exchange was quickly forgotten as I drove on, concentrating on my work and the sound of the engine, and everything seemed normal until I came to a remote section of road where a loud bang erupted from under the truck, and with no other choice, I grabbed some basic tools and climbed out to investigate what had happened. The tire had been torn apart and was beyond repair, so I sighed as I worked to replace the destroyed tire. My mind kept going back to what Davey had said about missing people along the way. "Damn it," I muttered as the truck lurched to a stop. Although this section of road was not going to stop me from completing my work, it did make me uneasy. Nevertheless, I completed the tire replacement more quickly than anticipated, got back on the road, and concentrated on getting to my destination without any more incidents or thoughts of unexplained events. Night had fallen as I continued, and the moon's light was shining through the dense forest, giving the shadows the appearance of being alive. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned a corner and noticed something strange on the side of the road, an apparently abandoned car. The doors were wide open and suitcases were strewn all over the place. I got out of my truck and went over to the abandoned car, and as I got closer, I noticed dark red stains all over the seats and dashboard. A wave of dread overcame me as I ventured deeper, holding my flashlight steady as my heart pounded in my chest, following a faint trail leading into the woods from the car's location. This, along with the unsettling silence that surrounded me, made my stomach turn. "Hello," my voice rang out in the cold night air, and I got no response except my own echo. A tall, lanky man with a lit cigarette between his lips flicked it away as soon as our eyes met. His face was hidden by shadows, but what stood out were his long fingers and strange arm reach that seemed to just hang by his side. There was a distinct sense of evil emanating from this strange man, sending shivers down my spine and a primal fear that made me want to flee. The man in front of me suddenly charged directly at me, and my reflexes finally kicked in. I ran back towards the road, my heart pounding in my chest, just as I reached the point where my instincts told me to run, but my body refused to move. When I realized I had forgotten my cell phone and couldn't call for help. 1,000 dark SC scenarios played out in my mind. I felt a wave of panic. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine, floored the gas pedal, and sped down the road as he followed me on foot. The man who had emerged from the trees near the abandoned car waved one of his abnormally long arms above his head, latching onto a protruding branch and swinging himself forward like a gory SP spider. I felt a brief wave of relief as I reached a curve in the road that led away from him. I didn't realize how far ahead of him I was, and I didn't want to risk slowing down to find out, so I continued driving for what felt like an eternity. His footsteps were accompanied by the sound of snapping branches as he moved through the forest at a breakneck speed. I had no desire to confront this dangerous man or understand his motivations. All I could think about was surviving this nightmare. After a long time, I finally arrived at my destination, a local police station, and tried to calmly describe my experience. I described an abandoned car covered in bloodstains that suggested terrible violence and an unsettling man who followed me and seemed almost supernatural. The officers listened carefully, but they didn't seem to believe that a particularly tall, lanky figure could be the cause of multiple missing persons cases. Some officers were sent to investigate the scene, while others concentrated on getting more information from the abandoned car's registration and getting in touch with family members connected to it. Hours went by before one officer called me over, "Mr. Reed," and his face started to change to one of concern. "We went to the place you described, and we need you to accompany us to identify the scene and assist us in clarifying the details." I was afraid, but I knew I had to cooperate, so I consented. They led me back to the woods, where the blood-stained car was still there, with bright police lights illuminating the area. As we got closer, I saw a body hanging from a tree close to the car, and I felt a sick feeling of dread as I watched the other police officers mutilate it. The terrible events that occurred there left a lasting scar that grew with every reference to this dark chapter in human history. The terrifying terror that occurred in those woods was finally put to an end when they apprehended the renegade man who was responsible for a horrific string of murders. His abnormalities turned out to be nothing more than genetic abnormalities, but his rage and deadly intent were definitely violent and genuine, as evidenced by a number of additional cases that surfaced during this dangerous man's trial. For every victim left behind unresolved questions or unmet expectations for closure as his crimes were made public. Countless others grieved the loss of loved ones who were brutally murdered by this sinister figure who lurked in the shadows. It's terrifying how one person's horrific actions can create a lasting impact on other people's lives. In September 2015, I was driving my truck through a remote area of rural Montana when all I could think about was how long it had been since I had last taken a shower. My dispatch orders led me down a path that passed a dense forest that seemed to go on forever. The road felt lonely, and I had been driving alone 4 hours when I made the decision to pull over for I didn't think much of taking a quick bathroom break, one of those less frequented rest stops, but I had no idea that this choice would change my life. My name is Stanley Davenport, and I'm just a regular truck driver who delivers goods across the nation. At times like these, my job can be rather unglamorous, but it pays the bills and allows me to travel to different places in America. I parked my truck, and in search of some privacy in this remote location, I went to the restroom. As soon as I walked inside, I smelled a mix of ammonia and something sweet and rotten that made me sick to my stomach. It didn't belong here with the smell of the trees and the fresh air, but nature called, so I went on toward the stalls after washing my hands. When I heard what sounded like muffled sobbing outside, I was worried that someone might be hurt, so I carefully went outside to look into it. Peering around the corner of the building, I saw a young woman, maybe 20 years old, kneeling next to a man who was lying motionless on the ground. He had tears in his eyes, and her blonde hair hung around her face like blood-soaked strings. Suffered fatal wounds. I hesitantly interrupted their desperate whispering and shouted, "Hey, do you need any help?" She looked up at me with terror in her eyes and gave me a slight nod. I hurried over to her just as she screamed in utter panic, and I barely had time to process what was happening before a huge figure with a long blood. The man appeared to be in his late 40s, with features deformed by innumerable scars and skin that was a sickly pale yellow hue. The menacing figure towered over me by at least a feet, and his forearms were the size of tree trunks, with veins bulging with every movement. I barely avoided the blow as the blade came swinging down with unstoppable force. He swung the blade at the young woman as I scurried back from my assailant, intending to kill me, but this time I caught him off guard by flinging a rock at his face and escaping. I screamed at her, avoiding his relentless attacks with every move, and I concentrated on staying alive, while also giving her enough time to flee toward my truck just as he stomped on the fallen girl's leg. Breaking it instantly, she screamed in pain and tried to crawl away, tears streaming down her face. I knew I had to act quickly or both of our lives would end here. Please help me, she begged through her sobs. It seemed like we had put enough distance between us and the monstrous man. I grabbed a nearby crowbar that had fallen from my truck during the chaos, ignoring the pain in my limbs from avoiding the attacks. As the young woman continued her futile attempts to crawl away, I yelled to her, "Make your way to my truck and grab anything that can help us against this guy." She nodded shakily and started crawling again, ignoring the pain radiating from her broken leg, but I remained focused. I threw another rock at the man's face to buy some time as he reeled back in anger. I then ran in the opposite direction, hoping he would follow. Unfortunately for both of us, he did, as I ran farther away from my truck and the monstrous man and his terrible blade. I shouted at her to make sure she understood the plan, knowing that waiting wasn't an option. I was at a construction site and quickly looked for anything that could be used as a weapon or distraction, anything that might save our lives. My mind was racing with potential escape plans and backup plans in case things went wrong. I thought about calling for help, but quickly realized that doing so would give the man pursuing me my location. A few moments later, I spotted a container. I had an idea while I was near a generator, so I kicked the gasoline container over and spilled its contents all over the ground. I then ran back to where I had left the young woman, hoping that she had found something useful in my truck. As I got to her side again, I could see that she had been busy while the monstrous man was chasing me, and she had managed to pull out a flare gun, something that might just turn this terrible situation in our favor at the right moment. Desperate, I took the flare gun from the woman's hand and pointed it at the approaching behemoth to get him to back off. I warned him, but to no avail. The man was unrelenting, so I pulled the trigger without hesitation, sending a fiery blast straight at him. The flare struck the raging fire, now devouring his own flesh, engulfed his face in an unbearable blaze, and his agonized screams reverberated through the air as he thrashed around. Blinded and seriously injured, he stumbled backward and fell onto the gasoline trail I had left earlier, which caused the fire to spread further, intensifying its wrath and engulfing him completely. Before long, all that was left of our attacker was a burnt husk, dead, and we needed emergency help, quickly, so I turned to the young woman who was now clutching her broken leg in agony. Unrecognizable, relief flooded my veins, and I dared to pull out my phone to call for help. Paramedics arrived in a matter of minutes, attended to both of our injuries, and then took us to a nearby hospital. During our recovery period, we didn't talk much about the traumatic event, because we both knew it was a nightmare. It was better left in the past, but I did know that we and everyone else that this vicious killer had probably targeted could finally rest easy knowing that this man would never hurt anyone again. Even though neither of us was physically or emotionally hurt during this ordeal, we both took some small solace in the knowledge that we were survivors and that we had survived stronger than in June 2009. I was trucking down a long stretch of highway just outside of Amos, Iowa, when I first met my tormentor. At first, around noon, I pulled over at a rundown diner for lunch. The grease-stained napkin dispensers, the worn linoleum floors, and a waitress named Marge, who had a disarming smile on her face, and I finished my burger and fries. I take pride in my job as a truck driver because it's honest work and gives me the opportunity to see the world outside of the typical 9-to-5 job. Sheriff deputies reported strange happenings in the area, including a series of heinous crimes with no evidence of the perpetrator. I dismissed this as idle gossip and continued on my way, getting back into my truck with the intention of arriving in Nevada by tomorrow. The majority of my cargo that day was fragile glassware, and as the sun started to set, the hours passed without incident. The landscape was one of pure serenity, with miles of open space, fields dotted with trees with leaves turning different shades of gold and yellow before my truck broke down, leaving me frustrated, but feeling up to the task. I got out and began checking the car. After doing the standard checks, I noticed nothing seemed wrong with the tire pressure, coolant temperature, oil level, and coolant level. But then things took an unexpected turn. As things got worse, I grabbed my CB radio to call for help when I noticed a white streak on the ground beneath my left rear tire, bone fragments, and pieces of flesh scattered across several yards of pavement. A new voice crackled over the frequency, a soft whisper that sounded like sandpaper, giving me goosebumps. "Ethan, don't you realize?" My eyes shot up, scanning the horizon on both sides of the highway, but all I saw were fields and a few sparse trees surrounded by darkness. "What are you doing?" I stammered, clutching my makeshift weapon, a tire iron. The only answer was sinister laughter that echoed through the speaker into the night air as if on cue headlights. Approaching like a knife through the last of the daylight, the engine hummed toward me before the car suddenly stopped 50 feet away. I could see him now, tall and slender with sharp features, and his eyes, which flickered in the light of his vehicle's headlights, seemed to contain untold depths of malice. He was wearing dark clothing, and he was holding something shiny in one twisted hand, a metallic glint. It turned out to be a blood-stained knife, and the man started to approach slowly and deliberately, stalking closer like a predator does to its prey. I had no choice but to take anything useful from my taxi and run into the wooded area, sprinting alongside the highway. Every nerve in my body screamed that he was still after me, and I could feel his presence like an itch between my shoulder blades, but I tried to avoid his hateful glare. With my legs hurting and my lungs burning, I found a brief respite in a small clearing under the canopy of branches. Times like these make me wish I had practiced running more than just driving. The trees blurred into streaks as I charged ahead, recklessly, trying my best to stay alive and not trip over stray row roots or fallen branches, and looked around frantically for any sign of assistance. Fortunately, I saw a small cabin nestled among the trees. As I approached the building carefully, my mind was racing with ideas about who might reside there and whether they could help me escape the relentless attacker. I hesitated at the door, but finally decided to knock because I knew that this might be my only chance to survive. Upon opening the door, an elderly man looked at me with interest and worrying on his face. Observing my messy appearance, he said, "What brought you here? You seem to be in trouble." To my relief, I was able to stammer out a brief explanation of what had happened, and the man invited me inside without asking. He gave me some water and promised that I could stay for as long as I needed to, and he said, "We'll call for help." The cabin owner explained that he rarely needed to call anyone and hadn't bothered to install a landline, adding that the closest police station wasn't too far away and that maybe we could visit there early in the morning. He firmly handed me a glass as we soon discovered an unfortunate obstacle. There was no cell reception in this remote area, and the closest pay phone was miles away. His understanding demeanor gave me comfort. As morning drew near, we got ready to head toward the police station. Just as we were ready to leave the cabin, something reflective caught my eye through one of the windows, an unmistakable glint creeping from behind. He had retired to this remote place years ago, over his wife's death, seeking solitude and some simplicity far from the chaos of city life. We talked late into the night. The old man could sense my uneasiness and join me at the window. The sight of the pursuer took him aback, his face pallid at the sight of my relentless stalker, and he promptly locked the door after realizing that the knife-wielding attacker had found me and had tracked me down with an unnerving tenacity, demonstrating how sinister and determined he truly was. After deciding that it would be best to wait for him to leave before trying any escape, we crept out of the cabin in terror, but with determination, never letting our guard down as we made our way to the safety of the police station. Once there, we recounted the events in detail, and I couldn't help but feel thankful that I had met a stranger who offered to help. Kindness and assistance when I needed it. The majority of authorities looked for the enigmatic assailant and eventually caught a man who fit the description. He had a blood-stained knife in his possession, deep-set eyes with malice lurking beneath angular features, casting sinister shadows on a lanky silhouette. I continued driving trucks and never again left my cargo unguarded or neglected to call for help. Life went on, haunted by fading memories of that terrifying night. But in the midst of that darkness, there was a resounding reminder of the old man's selflessness, a triumph of goodwill over all odds. Over time, the incident faded into obscurity, but those fruitful relationships remained etched in my memory. Occasionally, while I was driving, it was June 2017, and I was transporting a load of lumber to a remote construction site in the densely forested hills of Oregon, when nostalgia struck, transporting me back to that fateful night and serving as a chilling reminder that danger can lurk around every corner. My name is David Koslow. Long dark stretches, like the one I experienced that gloomy evening when I pulled up to the construction site at around 9:00 p.m., are definitely made more bearable by an experienced truck driver who thinks about life on the road in art that is laced with sardonic jokes and late-night coffee shop stops. Following when I got out of my truck to begin unloading, I thought, why can't they build a convenient deli just off the highway exit out here? Instead, I had to deal with hunger while they built opulent vacation homes after hauling lumber for years. The workers had finished for the day and had left behind floodlights that illuminated the makeshift office trailers, and skeletal frames sticking out from the freshly turned earth created an effective unloading system. And that night was no exception. I worked quickly to finish my work, but as I was about to lower another plank to the ground, I noticed something that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't unusual for wildlife to wander around construction sites in search of scraps, but something, despite my weak attempt to ignore it and carry on with my work, there was something unsettling about this specific sound, almost like heavy footsteps, mixed with sharp scratching noises that got louder and louder. "Hey," I yelled into the darkness, "anyone out there?" And got no response, so I unloaded a few more planks until an awkward burst of laughter slipped into my ears from a distance. "All right," I complained as cold sweat trickled down my neck. I needed to see what was going on, so I grabbed a hammer from my truck bed to protect myself if needed. As I made my way to the location I believed the sound came from, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched at every step. The air became heavy, and I could feel an unshakable presence lurking just out of sight, which is when I finally saw him. His filthy, tattered clothes hung from his skeletal frame, and his teeth looked jagged like a washboard stretched out in a sinister smile. For the first time, through the veil of darkness and trees, what appeared to be an exceptionally tall man emerged, wrapping his elongated fingers around a tree trunk to steady himself as he approached me. I froze in horror, unable to comprehend what I was seeing in the tall stranger. I was rendered speechless when he approached me without saying anything and with a malicious aura. "Hey," I stumbled and my voice trembled as I gripped the hammer more tightly. "What do you want?" he asked, continuing to stalk me like a sinister spectre hunting his prey. "Stay back," I warned him as panic surged deep within me. The stranger's hazelnut eyes locked onto and appeared to glaze over as he quickly drew closer to me. My heart raced with every step he took, pumping adrenaline through my veins as panic choked my breath. In a last-ditch attempt to defend myself, I screamed for assistance, hoping that someone nearby would hear me and assist me. I threw the hammer in his direction, watched as it struck him squarely in the head, and he staggered back a few steps, momentarily stunned, but not defeated. Taking advantage of his momentary confusion, I turned and ran back towards my truck, fumbling with my phone as I tried to call 911. "Please pick up," I whispered under my breath. The tall stranger seemed unfazed by my screams and continued to advance desperate. After what seemed like an eternity, the operator finally answered 911. "What's your emergency?" "Someone is attacking me," the operator said. "I'm at the construction site off Route 26. Please hurry." I managed to gasp and stay on the line. "Help is on its way," the operator said, as sirens wailed through the air. I held my breath as adrenaline surged through my veins and continued to run unexpectedly. It wasn't the sinister stranger who grabbed me from behind, but one of my co-workers, Adam, who had come back for a tool he had forgotten earlier, asked me in alarm, "Hey, what are you doing?" Because I was screamed and panicked, and I talked about the tall stranger who had attacked me while still keeping an eye on where he had been earlier. Adam didn't seem to see him. He led me back to the safety of the truck as we waited for authorities to arrive. A few moments later, police cars swarmed into view, sirens blaring and officers rushing out of their vehicles. We arrived as quickly as we could, and an officer said, "I don't see anyone," he said, cautiously. "Did they leave?" "We should wait in the truck for help." I described the incident, terrifying encounter with the tall stranger, as the officer took notes and used his hand to silence my co-worker, who attempted to interrupt, stating that he couldn't believe he had seen anyone. The police then dispersed among the trees, looking for any sign of the threatening assailant, but they couldn't find anything. The only thing that remained was the memory of him and my desperate call to 911. Even after I had given her, my co-workers arrived at work as night turned to dawn, and word of my terrifying encounter spread quickly at the construction site. Many asked me for more details, and some shared their theory, i.e. about who this person could have been, though they weren't sure. I gave a detailed description of the tall stranger and his tattered appearance, but the officers were unable to find him or connect him to anyone in the area. Whether it was a sick joke or a real threat to our safety, we were all on edge. Days went by, but no one saw the tall stranger again. The police declared the case unsolved, but maintained a close watch on the site, and my co-workers and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were being watched as we went about our work. Even after hearing about those terrible events, the image of his sharp teeth still troubled me in times of solitude. Even though he left no trace behind, his sinister smile haunted me occasionally. As time went on, I remembered less about that Spooky night, until it became part of our workplace lore, a horrifying fragment of our shared experience that was never repeated or explained. With each day that went by, life returned to normal as we all continued with our jobs. But deep down in my heart, etched uncomfortably in my memory, will the mark left by one bone-chilling night that defied logic but never completely vanished. Into oblivion will always be those evil eyes. In October 1995, I was driving my old semi-true down a remote Wyoming road in an attempt to deliver a shipment on time. My name is Russell Carson, and I was a 31-year-old truck driver at the time. That day had begun like any other, with me getting up at a truck stop, eating breakfast, and heading out. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something off to the side of the road, a wrecked car with its hazards still blinking. I radioed for help and went back to work before any guilt could set in. I laughed to myself. I guess it's a good thing I'm not an EMT. Imagine how guilty I would feel. The day went smoothly as the sun started to set, and eventually I saw another car parked by the side of the road. It was a rusty pickup with the hood up once more. I pulled over and got out of my truck to make sure everything was all right, but as I got closer to the pickup, I saw that something wasn't quite right. There were deep scratches in the paint that appeared to be haphazard, and they were scattered all over the additionally. There were what looked like bloody handprints on the windows of the vehicle. Uneasy, but cautious not to assume anything too sinister from the appearance alone, I called out to see if anyone needed assistance, but no one answered. Deciding not to stay any longer than necessary, I went back to my truck and drove on, mentally noting where this strange scene had occurred as night fell and darkness descended. A few miles down the road, what appeared to be an overturned tractor-trailer caused me to screech to a halt. Disgusted and unnerved, I got out of my truck to inspect the wreckage, but as soon as I did, a foul stench filled my nostrils, forcing me to take a rag out of my pocket for some respite. The overturned trailer had been ripped open and scattered all over the place where I was trying to figure out what might have happened when I heard a faint rustling behind me. I slowly turned around and saw the tall man in tattered clothes, or what was left of them, with his hands smeared with blood and dirt hanging limply at his sides, his hair matted and disheveled, and his eyes, which were pure black with no visible whites. Survival instincts took over as I ran back to my truck, with the man right on my heels and barely making it inside. I locked the door just as he slammed into it, breathing heavily, fumbled for the keys, started the engine, and managed to shift into gear while keeping my eyes open. Irises conveying an unsettling presence of menace terror gripped me. The man charged at me with frightening speed. Locked on this terrifying brood outside my truck, the man started slamming his fists against the window in a furious rage, determined to break through. Panic struck when I saw cracks forming in the glass, revving the engine, and I fled the scene as quickly as I could, crashing through road debris as my heart pounded loudly inside the speeding vehicle. I was unable to hear any other vehicles, but by pure luck or divine intervention, a police cruiser appeared up ahead. They must have been dispatched to look into every accident that occurred along this isolated stretch of road, so I flashed my hide beams and honked repeatedly until I got their attention. In the flickering red and blue lights of their cruiser, I got a final look at the insane man, his hollow eyes staring and boring into the police officers radioed for backup, and soon we were part of a small convoy with 2 more squads joining in. They escorted me to the closest police station for my safety, even though my soul was getting smaller and farther away with every second that went by as the police cruiser followed me. I kept driving at breakneck speed in an attempt to get away from that monstrous man. I told Detective Jones everything I could recall about my experience at the station, and he promised to conduct a thorough search for any indications of the man who had followed me. As they assembled a team to look into the attack scene, I sat in the waiting area feeling both relieved and afraid. The detective later told me that they had found nothing out of the ordinary at the site or trace of the man who pursued me. It seemed as though he had disappeared into thin air. Nevertheless, they discovered evidence of a temporary camp close by, indicating that someone had been residing there for a while. Detective Jones then questioned me further, asking if I knew anyone who might harbor such animosity toward me or anyone who had recently shown signs of instability. I had no answers for him. It seemed completely irrational and terrifying after I gave my statement at the station. I called my best friend Tom to come get me. He came a short while later and asked if I was okay. I didn't answer. I just wanted to go home. No one knew why that man had singled me out or what his intentions were. And even though it scared me, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. 4 days later, sleep finally took me back to safety after Tom drove me home. Everywhere I went or did, a persistent feeling of dread hovered over me like a heavy cloud. One night, as I watched TV, the news reported on a horrific murder outside an abandoned warehouse not far from where I had encountered the victim. The victim was found mauled to death, with claw marks all over their body, and a terrifying message written in blood spade over the warehouse walls. I am Tom and Jennifer, my close friends, did everything in their power to help me deal with the trauma. They alternately stayed with me to make sure I was okay. But Detective Jones assured me that they would not rest until they caught the culprit and promised to keep me informed on the progress of their investigation. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had chased me was responsible for this brutal murder. The terrible villain who stalked me that fateful night seemed to be virtually absent from this world, haunting my every thought as I pieced together what might have happened to him or why he had chosen me as his victim. Eventually, Detective Jones gave me a final update on their progress or lack thereof. As the days stretched into weeks and authorities found no new leads or clues. My friends supported me through the entire ordeal, telling me that we had each other's backs no matter what. However, life returned to normal for us all, and we spent our evenings together eating pizza and laughing at dumb jokes that I never learned. Before I shared my condolences and assured him that he would keep looking until he found answers. It wasn't much comfort knowing that the bloodthirsty man could still be out there hunting other people. To never take anything for granted again, because someone out there has lost a loved one to a senseless and heartbreaking act similar to the one that almost killed me. Who knew how many other victims there were, or even what horrors awaited them in those last moments before meeting their grisly end. Although I forced those thoughts out of my mind, they lingered in the back of my mind as a stark reminder that danger can strike at any time, and I'm not a Jensen, and normally my runs through the heartland are uneventful. The route was to collect lumber from Bentley Sawmill, which is tucked away deep within a remote forest in Montana. Life on the road had begun to shape me into a comedian of sorts. That vigilance is the only thing that separates life and death. It was November 208 when I received a new assignment for my truck driving job. The drive through the winding, narrow roads was slow and monotonous, and when I finally arrived at Bentley Sawmill, I realized how disconnected it was from any kind of civilization. I soon found that the place was even more eerie than it first appeared, with a few workers wrapping up their shift, covered in sweat and sawdust, as they loaded my truck with lumber oddities. It was like an off-brand Chris Christopherson traveling through America, one joke at a time. Franken Walsh, a worker, mentioned that something had been going on around here lately. He had stopped briefly to get some water before going home, so I raised an eyebrow, thinking it was strange that squirrels were eating your lunch. Frank laughed, but he quickly shook his head, returning to his serious demeanor. Even worse than that, last week someone from our crew vanished on his way home from work 2 days after he was, Frank insisted gravely, before leaving that evening as darkness descended on the once calm forest, now teeming with creeping silhouettes of darkness. I parked my truck outside the sawmill for the night and crawled into my sleeping bag in its cabin the next morning, after finding mauled and disfigured near a couple of trees. I grimaced but forced out a small laugh. "You're just trying to scare the novice trucker. No joke this time, kid. Started off normally enough, untangling myself from my sleep domain and massaging my weary eyes as I got ready to begin another long day. As I was leaving my truck cabin, I noticed a large puddle of crimson liquid spilling out onto the muddy ground next to the truck. A worker rushed over, his eyes widening at the sight, and he stammered, unable to conceal his shock. We all exchanged unexplained looks, and I couldn't stop thinking about Frank's story. The following days were frightening. More incidents happened, including equipment destruction, tree slashing, and strange noises that reverberated through the dense forest at night. Frank's colleague was discovered unconscious by a road, with no memory of what had happened to him. As we talked about the strange events, I yelled over dinner with a few employees in the small Somo canteen, "You're telling me Earl believes it's a guy who has a grudge against our boss," saying that one worker was adjusting his hat and he saw him, but the worker shook his head. This is just an insane theory based on all these incidents, so I concentrated on the ground and tried to figure out what he was doing. The next evening, while reading my favorite paperback thriller in my truck cabin, I heard a sudden clang against its side. Peering out my window into the darkness, I could just make out a figure running away from my truck toward the dense woods, gaining from smashing up our equipment and hurting people. Silence filled the room as we looked at each other with concern etched on our faces. As I hurried through the forest, following hazy movements everywhere, I felt an overwhelming force push me to the ground and drag me along suddenly, but somehow knowing it wasn't uncalculated. With my heart racing frantically, I decided to give chase into the darkness out of dread and mystery fear that gripped my insides. The force pulling me through the forest finally stopped, and a man with a sadistic grin appeared. His tall, muscular frame towered over me like a giant, and I realized in the chaos of the chase that I had left my phone in my truck cabin. This left me stuck in this situation with no way to ask for help. Was bald and covered in horrific tattoos of violent scenes, and as he stared at me with a spooky smile, his cold eyes burned with violent intent. "I've been waiting for you," he whispered, his voice full of malice. He pulled me to a makeshift cage made out of scrap metal and wooden logs, which was a clear indication that he had been planning this for a while. He threw me inside and locked the door, leaving me alone. He taunted me, saying that he had found our operations despite being deep in the forest. But it's what I do find those who think they're alone safe in their solitude and then take control. The cage was surrounded by broken equipment and the remains of previous victims who weren't lucky enough to survive their encounters with him. Find your trail easy enough. This sick person tortured his gullible victims by preying on their weaknesses, and even though I had no other choice, I decided that I would no longer be his plaything. As night fell, I looked around the cage once more and frantically looked for anything that could be used as a weapon or tool to aid my suffering. He did this by occasionally rattling the cage or swinging something sharp against its bars. In the midst of my panic and search, I discovered a broken but sturdy tree branch near my cage. Knowing that it would be disastrous to draw attention to my plan, I moved slowly and carefully, inch by inch, guiding the branch through the cage's bars until I could point its pointed end against the lock and pry it open. With bated breath, I made my move and exited the cage, removing the chain around me as I moved. My ankle clinked loudly, alerting the man to my attempt to flee. His ferocious growl reverberated throughout the forest as he charged at me, running away as we ran, with little time and self-preservation taking over. I grabbed a nearby rock and threw it at him with all my strength. The rock struck his face, momentarily stunning him and providing I had a small window of time to run for my life. But I lost him in the eerie darkness of the forest on my way back to the sawmill. All I could think about was warning people to stay away from this monster that was hiding in our workspace. When I finally arrived at the sawmill, panting from exhaustion and my adrenaline-fueled escape, I frantically told Earl and the others what had happened, and they listened with growing Horror. Every detail was shared in a matter of seconds, and Earl organized the workers to alert anyone in the vicinity of our location about this sadistic psychopath. Regular shifts were transformed into search parties to stop him from spreading his influence further into our community, and no one else died during those horrible days. We were never able to apprehend him, and he vanished from our lives as abruptly as he had appeared. After a while, things at the sawmill started to get back to normal, but we never forget what happened or the people we lost because of that dementia-stricken person. September 2012. My name is Hank Larson, and I drive a truck and I regularly deliver cargo to isolated locations across the United States. One particular route took me this time as I approached a particularly dense forested area. I couldn't help but notice something unusual about it. Smoke was billowing out from inside the woods like a volcanic eruption on an island paradise gone deep into Nevada, where cell phone reception was nothing more than a myth. Every time I took this route, I told myself some of my funniest stories in an attempt to forget that unnerving scream in the woods surrounding the track last month. Curiosity overcame me, and I abruptly stopped, choosing to go outside and investigate whatever was causing it, carefully navigating through tangled foliage and foreboding-looking trees. I came to rest in front of the charred remains of a small cabin that had been completely destroyed by fire. It appeared as though the inferno had just occurred because the smoke was still present and warm enough to feel on my skin when I suddenly noticed movements coming from behind one of the rotting timber beams. A man with soot and ash all over him, his hair burned at the ends, and his face barely recognizable with those eerie wide eyes, might have appeared to be a living corpse if it weren't for his tall stature and muscular build. Characteristics. I stayed where I stood while he stared at me silently. The whole scene gave me the uneasy feeling that something evil was hiding behind his eyes, but it was unknown at the time. In an effort to defuse the situation, I said aloud to him with a half-hearted smile, which brought back memories of my uncle trying to grill hamburgers for us for the first time, maybe with the exception of his face twisted into a twisted grimace, as if he were fighting some internal torment or pain, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His eyes seemed to skin me like a predator assessing its prey. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered in a raspy voice that sent a shockwave through Emmy. He was still motionless and silent, showing no signs of amusement at my joke. I was just wondering what had happened when I stammered out, trying to stay composed, but failing miserably. The man took a step toward me, and his movements were incredibly quick and fluid for someone so big. I instinctively matched his step backward, but I stumbled over my own misplaced footing. My heart was racing, and I knew I had to leave this man. He kept moving forward, slowly gaining distance between me and the forest foliage. I scurried backwards ungracefully. Every time his foot touched the ground, it came down with an almost supernatural force that shook the earth beneath it. This is not normal for a man of such a thin physique. As I struggled to maintain distance between us, my breathing became short gasps, and the hardship became more evident as each second threatened to encroach on darkness, which would swallow me whole. "This is no place for you," he venomously. That phrase, eyes blazing with malice as they locked onto mine again, replayed in my head as panic filled my body, providing the energy for an adrenaline-fueled sprint that enabled me to try to put as much distance between him and myself as possible. Trees beside me turned into green streaks, and underbrush crunched beneath heavy footfalls, indicating unbridled desperation flowing through my blood. Vessels, as though poisonous venom shots, rang out behind me, bullets cutting through the air with a snap and bouncing off of the trees. My mind raced as the insane man chased me, and my adrenaline pushed me to run faster. My knowledge that I couldn't outrun him forever made me search for a place to hide and possibly call for assistance. Spying her, I dove into the thick thicket nearby, in the hopes that the tangled branches would hide my presence. My hands fumbled in my pockets for my phone, as the gunshots kept coming closer and closer until I finally took out my phone and dialed 911. My voice trembled as I whispered to the operator about my situation and begged for assistance. She assured me that officers were on their way and advised me to remain hidden and quiet. An angular face with sharp lines and a hooked nose that stood out prominently, his unkempt beard harbored in unnatural darkness in the shadows cast on his face, and his rugged clothes with visible stains that spoke of a long pursuit were all signs of the terrifying man approaching. His relentless pursuit was marked by the sound of underbrush snapping beneath his boots, and I held my breath, fearing that any sound would reveal my position. Nomadic existence, the gunfire suddenly ceased and was replaced by the man's raspy breathing as he looked around for any sign of me. It sounded like he was searching with all of his senses, not just his eyes, as a predator would do at all costs to find its prey. Then I heard distant sirens wailing in response to my frantic call for assistance, and the man heard them too. His eyes briefly darted around before he, snarling and frustrated, I turned and disappeared into the forest like a ghost. A moment later, I staggered out of my hiding place, and police officers rushed in to secure the area, while medical staff attended to my cuts and bruises. Overwhelmed by what had happened, I told them everything that had happened from the first time I saw the man until he disappeared into the woods. As the investigation went on, I heard the sirens and discovered that they had been looking for him for some time. He was a wanted criminal who had been raging through the forest, stalking and attacking innocent people. Other victims, like me, had come into contact with the sinister man. Some had survived, while others met terrible ends at his hands when the officers interrogated me. I told them that fear had completely paralyzed me when we first met, and that it wasn't until I was running in blind panic and desperation that I realized I needed to call for help. They understood, but they also stressed how important it is to call for help as soon as possible in similar situations. The fact that the monster wasn't a supernatural creature, but rather a deranged man, didn't make the haunting memories of those traumatic events go away, though his reign of terror was short-lived due to the prompt response of law enforcement. It served as a stark reminder to remain vigilant, and the police continued their search for him. At times, my heart ached for those who perished as a result of his violent tendencies, and I hoped that he would be brought to justice eventually. With each day that goes by, life returns to normal, but those who come into contact with the man will always bear the scars of that encounter. As we recover and become stronger, we also remember those who were lost and hope that this twisted person will eventually pay for his actions. To ensure that no more innocent lives are lost will always be tainted by his harmful presence. It was June 1996, and I had just finished discussing our weekend plans with my co-workers. My name is Ellis Montgomery, and I work as a regular truck driver for a small logistics company in a small Oregon town. But I frequently found solace in the solitude of traveling through large forests and barren roads. Something about the atmosphere of my next journey seemed intimidating. The little dirt path that took me to my delivery location seemed unremarkable enough, but the pervasive smell of decay permeated the air. It was almost like the eerie smell clung to my nostrils, choking me with every breath, rather than allowing it to disturb me. I tried to dismiss it as some sort of rot or waste from a nearby farm, driving along the narrow road line with tall trees casting menacing shadows on either side. I finally arrived at the drop-off point, which was an apparently deserted construction site that appeared to have been unoccupied for years. I parked my truck and went outside to inspect the seemingly innocent array of dusty machinery and rusted equipment scattered about, and I suddenly felt uneasy. I heard a faint but distinct sound of footsteps echoing in the distance behind me, and as I turned to look for the person responsible, all I could see was empty surroundings enveloped by an eerie silence and darkness that seemed to press against me. I watched from a distance as the once light-hearted jokes shared with co-workers hours ago felt like distant memories as unshakable dread set in. Closer and louder until they stopped suddenly behind me. I turned slowly, my heart thumping in my chest, and saw a man leaning against one of the rusty cranes. His harsh features were distorted by shadow, and his piercing eyes were emotionless. His loose, dirty clothes appeared to blend in with their surroundings, so I couldn't see the man's face clearly enough to identify him, and I didn't care what you wanted, I choked out, wondering why he hadn't responded verbally. Instead, he extended his arm and pointed with one long finger at a spot just to my left and back. It was obvious that he didn't have a good reason for me, so I turned my eyes toward the truck driver. Instincts in me kicked in. I scurried back towards my truck and realized that the stench from earlier wasn't from a nearby farm, but rather a gruesome display of what appeared to be mutilated animal remains arranged in a haunting pattern across the dirt floor. Panic struck as my mind raced to try to piece together who this man was and what these bizarre acts signified. A subliminal warning that had gone unnoticed as I frantically jumped into the cab and struggled with the lock. When I looked up, I saw the sinister figure approaching my car with a menacing air of malice in every slow, deliberate step. I wasn't sure how far or how quickly I could drive away from this insane person before he got too close. But come on, Ellis, you've got this, whispered under my breath, barely able to contain my delirious laughter at my ridiculous joke, as fear threatened to overwhelm me. I quickly started the engine as soon as the man arrived at the side of my truck, adrenaline pumping through my veins more powerful than ever, my tires screeching as I sped off with reckless determination. Desperately trying to, I finally grabbed my phone and dialed 911, barely able to form a coherent sentence, because fleeing the threat that seemed to be getting closer by the second was vital. I gasped into the phone. I drove away from the terrifying scene of the man slowly approaching my truck. I took turns, not really knowing where they were. A high-pitched scream shattered through the night air, causing my foot to slam on the brakes. The sound was terrifying, unlike anything I had ever heard before, and it seemed to come from directly ahead, but my mind told me not to look for answers. Instead, I clutched my steering wheel with a shaky hand. Lead all that mattered was putting as much distance between myself and him as possible. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard sirens approaching in the distance, possibly indicating that help was on the way or that there was still hope, but it was too late. Suddenly, the figure appeared in front of my truck once more, a hair-raising grin plastered on his face that seemed to reveal an intense pleasure in this twisted game of cat and mouse, and surrounded the man. There was no time for relief. The officers took their weapons and began shouting commands at the insane man, who paused for a moment before resuming his depraved behavior by lunging onto one of them and sinking his teeth into their throat. Horrified screams filled the air as more officers attempted in vain to subdue him. But as chaos and bloodshed broke out all around me, I realized that whatever desperate to get away from the horrific scene, I pressed the accelerator once more and hurried to the closest town. With a trembling hand, I knocked on a resident's door in the hopes that they would offer assistance. The door slowly opened, and an older couple asked me what had happened as I described it. What happened next might be far worse than what those mutilated animal remains had warned me about earlier that day. I think it's that Luna Dew escaped from the mental hospital last week, the husband whispered to his wife as they urged me to sit down and catch my breath. Finally safe, I collapsed on their couch, just moments away from passing out when I heard sirens approaching in the distance. The events of the night barely made sense for them to comprehend my story, which made me frantic. They let me in and locked their door behind us. As dawn broke, one of the officers came to us with an update. We've caught him, and he won't be hurting anyone else. Relief swept over me like a wave, but I forced myself to stay awake as hopelessness started to seep into my consciousness. I did this by listening to the distant siren sounds that broke the tense silence in the room. My days as a truck driver vanished into a rearview mirror filled with memories of mutilated remains and piercing emotionless eyes, and I couldn't help but feel sad for those lost in the gory endeavor, especially that courageous officer who died, trying to save money. They were shaken and scarred by that nightmare ordeal with the mysterious man whose motivations were never revealed or understood. On a chilly March morning in 2016, I was traveling my usual route from Austin to Dallas, Texas, when I vividly recall feeling at ease and content as the sun slowly rose above the rolling hills. My name is Zev Clayton, and I have been a truck driver for more than 15 years. During that time, I have encountered many fascinating people, but never the first indication that something was wrong occurred just outside the small town of Rockdale, when my truck's daring tires crashed through an unidentifiable pile of thick red sludge on the side of the road. The stench was so foul that it left a spoiled milk aftertaste in the back of your mouth. There was nothing that could have prepared me for what was about to happen along the isolated highways of East Texas. I called my friend and fellow driver, Zeke, on the radio as I continued to travel north past the eerie location. "Hey Zeke, have you ever come across something so foul-smelling while on a route?" I joked grudgingly, and Zeke laughed back. "That's nothing compared to the time I accidentally drove over a skunk in North Dakota." Hearing his laughter helped me feel better about the situation a few miles later, but my attitude changed drastically when I spotted an oddly familiar figure standing near the road ahead. As I approached this person, who was wearing unkempt clothing covered in dried stains of unknown origin, it became evident that he had no intention of asking for help or hitching a ride, but I couldn't help but notice that his emaciated frame made him appear less than human, caused his clothing to hang off him, nags on a scarecrow. What worried me even more was his face or lack thereof, which seemed to have no distinguishable features, but instead stared back with a blank emptiness that somehow seemed sinister and menacing. My heart raced faster with every second as I decided it was best to continue despite my curiosity, and I couldn't get rid of the overwhelming feeling of dread that had been growing inside me for hours as the truck continued on its path, leaving this terrifying figure behind. No matter how fast or far I drove, the feeling of foreboding wouldn't go away. And then, out of nowhere, a bony hand slammed against my truck's window, shocking me with the horrifying scene. I tried to radio Zeke for assistance after a figure mysteriously caught up to my truck and loomed over me with a twisted expression of malevolence. However, all that came through was an unidentifiable scraping noise that sounded like a cross between the guttural roll of thunder and nails on a chalkboard. I sped up in an attempt to put as much distance between myself and the figure as possible, but it seemed that no matter how fast I went, it was always just behind me. I picked up my cell phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. The operator asked, "What's your emergency?" I could barely make out the villain's horrifying visage through my peripheral vision, and there was no obvious way to escape. "There's someone chasing me while I'm driving my truck on Route 50. It's terrifying. It doesn't even seem human." I hesitantly stopped, adding, "Please help me." I clung to my phone like it was my lifeline and drove faster as the operator responded urgently, saying, "We're dispatching a patrol car to your location. Please stay on the line." Desperation gripped me, wondering how I would get out, but a few moments later, I noticed red and blue lights starting to close on us when the figure effortlessly extended its long arms and grabbed the approaching police car by the hood with terrifying strength. It threw the vehicle clear off the road and began chasing me again, instantly bringing me back into a state of high alert. I radioed any nearby drivers for assistance, and "Anyone out there, please help." Relief flooded through me as help finally arrived, but my relief quickly turned to horror. "I'm being followed by something that just destroyed a police car," a voice said on the radio. "You seem to be in serious trouble. Let's see what we can do to help." Shortly after, two trucks pulled up beside mine from opposite directions in perfect synchronization, forming a triangle. I didn't even bother to look back. One of the drivers radioed, just stepped on it, and continued driving. The two other drivers got out of their trucks and came up to me. "It was intense," one said. Never seen anything like that before. We're lucky we all emerged unharmed. We'll stay beside you with our collaborative efforts. We were able to outpace the monstrous figure for miles at one point, but it seemed to disappear as quickly as it had appeared exhausted. I finally stopped on the side of the road. Our 3 trucks and cell phone records provided ample evidence of our encounter with that mysterious figure, so our story was deemed credible by law enforcement. Sobbedly, we called the police again to report the terrifying incident and cautiously moved toward where they had parked to provide the necessary statements. I could hardly contain my shivers when I thought about what we had just gone through, unable to find the creature that had terrorized us on Route 50. The details of my encounter were kept in strict confidentiality as I carried on with my trucking career, anxiously awaiting any sign of the figure's return. Years later, I still can't get over what happened that terrible night, and my heart starts when I see a lone figure at night on a deserted stretch of highway. Throbbing with terror, but occasionally during my lengthy hauls, I find comfort in the knowledge that too, other truckers put their lives in danger to save me from injured strangers who banded together in the darkest hour to battle an unfathomable evil. I also pay tribute to those who lost their lives or were hurt during encounters with such terrifying creatures. They are courageous individuals whose tales should be honored and remembered. My name is Barry Lakes, and I have been a truck driver for a little over 5 years. You could say that trucking runs in my family because my dad used to drive cross-country for work. I never really mind the long hours on the road, and it allowed me to see parts of America that others could only imagine. However, everything changed for me in June 2014. I was driving down the interstate just outside of Rapid City, South Dakota, carrying pallets of boxed snacks to be delivered way out in Oregon. The sun had already set, and I occasionally found comfort in driving late at night when there was less traffic. The sky was covered in millions of diamond-like stars that seemed to stretch into the infinite. My headlights revealed something odd as I rounded a sharp bend in the road. A standard sedan that looked to have veered off the road and collided with a tree. Glass and debris were all over the place, and all of the airbags were activated. I stopped to see if anyone needed help, and as I approached the scene, I saw bloodstains all over the ground, but there were no signs of the driver or anyone else. The eerie silence quickly became overwhelming as my curiosity and anxiety grew steadily. I called 911 for help because I knew someone might be hurt nearby, and I tried not to imagine the worst. It felt like an eternity waiting for emergency services to arrive. Then, about 20 feet from where I was standing, a soft rustling sound came from some bushes at the edge of the woods. Breaking into the events that followed will always be etched in my memory. A man, or what once was a man, appeared from behind the foliage with movements that seemed out of the ordinary. His eyes were wide, and his bloodshot pupils dilated to the point where only a thin ring of blue iris was visible. I approached it, cautiously in the hopes of finding whoever survived this terrible accident so they could get help quickly. The fact that he didn't say anything, didn't cry out for help, and didn't acknowledge my presence further chilled me. His face was covered in dried blood, and pieces of flesh hung from his exposed gums where his teeth had been. He started to approach me with lurching steps that revealed whatever injury had turned him into this horror, both arms hanging limply by his sides, one hand crudely wrapped in filthy panic struck, and I hurried back to my truck to call the police again. As I talked to the dispatcher and kept my eyes on him, he continued his eerie approach, and soon he arrived at the edge of the road. He found himself standing by the driver's side door of my car. I begged the dispatcher to stay on the line and keep an eye on him until we arrived. When a police cruiser finally pulled up at a breakneck pace, 2 officers jumped out of their car, and he produced an angular piece of broken glass and started carving intricate designs into his forearm. He seemed oblivious to the pain this must have caused, as dark red blood dripped down his arm and pooled on the ground. It was disgusting. Fear gripped me as I held onto my phone, the dispatcher still on the other end whispering, as the officers cautiously approached with guns aimed at the man in a sideways stance. They shouted at the man to drop the piece of glass and get on the ground, but he didn't seem to notice their presence and continued to carve patterns into his own flesh while staring blankly at me. Assurances that everything would be okay. The officers were now only a few feet away from the man, and although their commanding voices should have persuaded him to comply, the man refused to acknowledge them. Suddenly, the glass fell out of his hand, and he reached for his unkempt forearm. With strength that defied his ragged appearance, he tore off the rags to reveal a brand new carving that made everyone gasp in horror. I could only stare in agony as one of the officers pulled him to the ground and placed handcuffs on his wrists, as though in reaction to his abrupt confinement. The man let out a grotesque cacophony that will always haunt me. Backup arrived with an ambulance, and they prepared a stretcher for him. I watched numbly from my truck as paramedics evaluated his self-inflicted injuries. A few moments after my injuries, an officer came up to me with a worried expression on her face. "Sir," she said tentatively, "are you okay? We'll take it from here." I stuttered. "I don't understand. Was he after me? Why did he do that to himself?" She shook her head, only responded, "We're not sure yet. It could be a serious accident, or he was in this state because of trauma." And I felt something wasn't right, that everyone there, including those tasked with protecting us, somehow didn't know about this man. Why didn't they tell me? As they carried him into the ambulance, I made the decision that tonight events should be kept a secret. I had requested assistance, but something profound. I grudgingly thanked the person who had whispered in my gut that there was nothing that could be done to help this twisted tale. Police and fled the tumultuous situation by retreating into my truck had transpired. I remembered the man's eerie gaze fixed on me until at the very end, I had a lingering sense of dread as the panic crawled up my spine. In the days that followed, every time I told my family and friends the story again, I never found out what had happened to the troubled person and why he seemed obsessed with me or even his name. I occasionally felt curious, but I was afraid of uncovering anything worse than. Despite all, one thing was evident from that depressing encounter. Every scary one thing that stuck in my mind from that chilly night was that someone had passed away right before I came to that lonely road as a tourist who, like me, had no idea what the victims of that night would always haunt me. The unidentified traveler, as they awaited them in those hollow shadows, who died in a post-apocalyptic collision, and the man who disfigured himself in cold blood. Their unexplained stories and the terrors that uninvestigated made me think of our fragile life is an incomprehensible game, that we can never forecast the time or manner of our numbers call.